What happens to buildings, towns, and cities when all the people move out? Does anybody else move in? Or are they left standing empty like monuments of a forgotten town? What might be the true story of the empty spaces in your hometown or city? Questions like this interest us, which is why we're always excited to find out about amazing abandoned spaces. If that thought excites you, then you're going to love this video because it's full of them. Right in the heart of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA, sits the abandoned Fishtown power plant that once used to supply the whole area around it. It's mostly been abandoned since 2004, although one or two of the old units continued to run until 2009. You'd never know that its abandonment was so recent by looking at it, though. The state of decay is so advanced that you could easily believe it's been mothballed for decades. The official word is the planning permission for hotels and restaurants on the site has been granted, but that was in 2017. As of late 2020, there's no sign of any development work getting underway here. Looking at the graffiti and the crumbling brickwork, we can't help but feel that this is no way to treat a 100-year-old building. The rusty towers might be a bit of an eyesore, but the vast interior of the turbine hall would make for a perfect performance or display space. This place used to rattle and hum with the electricity that passed through it. Now it's silent, other than the birds who've broken in through the windows and set up nests. While we're in Philadelphia, let's also take a look at Pier 18, or as it's known to the local residents, Graffiti Pier. It isn't hard to figure out how it got its nickname. This former coal loading dock has been abandoned for a very long time and has become a canvas for the city's street artists. The graffiti is technically illegal, but the city's authorities appear to turn a blind eye. Perhaps they think it's better to allow graffiti artists to have a space here to work with rather than spreading to other areas. That idea might soon be tested, though, after almost 30 years of abandonment that began when Conrail closed the pier in 1991. It's been purchased by the Delaware River Waterfront Company. They plan to build a park at this riverside spot, and the pier would be included in that plan. Because of that, we'll probably see fences erected around Pier 18 very soon, shortly followed by the washing away of 3 decades worth of tags and artwork. Airports take up a huge amount of space. When a major city decides that its airport is no longer fit for its purpose, it tends to redevelop its existing facilities rather than building new ones. That isn't the case in Berlin, Germany, where the old Templehof Airport is still standing despite the fact that it's been considered obsolete since 2008. Perhaps this veteran facility deserves to be kept, though. It's a relic of the early days of air travel, having been built in 1923. Very little of that 1923 structure remains today, though. The whole complex was redeveloped during the Nazi era, with an enormous eagle-shaped building designed by Professor Ernst Sagebiel, created as an act of symbolism. The tunnels and bunkers that run below the airport are another piece of war legacy at the site. Perhaps the most impressive architectural feature here is the mile-long canopy roof, which extends so far that aircraft could taxi below it and allow passengers to board without the risk of getting cold or wet. During the Cold War, half of the airport was given over to the U.S. Air Force, who added a basketball court and a bowling alley. Its 2008 closure was due to environmental concerns, and the site's now in a state of limbo as politicians try to work out what to do with it. While the Templehof Airport could partially be considered as an example of Nazi architecture, the abandoned holiday apartment facility of Prora on Rügen Island is 100% a Nazi idea, dreamt up by Hitler himself. Hitler was of the opinion that every German deserved an annual beach holiday, so long as they went where he told them to go on the dates he stipulated. Prora was said to be the place that this fun week in the sun would happen. He ordered the construction of the 8-building facility during the 1930s, but abandoned his plan when his invasion of Poland turned into the Second World War and money was needed elsewhere. The 10,000 or so rooms eventually found a new purpose as care provision for the elderly and infirm. But by the end of the 1990s, the site was showing its age and no longer fit for purpose. It then began 30 years of abandonment, although part of the site is currently being redeveloped into condos and brand new holiday apartments, bringing Prora full circle. Hopefully, the new rooms and suites will be a lot nicer than the ones they're replacing. Nuclear power stations are notoriously expensive things to build. The people who pick up the bill for the construction work have to hope that the money that they make from either operating or selling the facility will be more than it cost them to create it in the first place. That proved not to be the case with Marble Hill Power Station, which is in Jefferson County, Indiana, USA. Despite over $2.5 billion being spent on the plant, it never produced so much as a single watt of electricity. Looking back on what went wrong, it might have been a victim of the era it was built in. Work began in 1977 with the promise of jobs for local people and cheap energy for Indiana. But 2 years later, the infamous 3 Mile Island disaster happened. The public's attitude toward nuclear power changed, and there was no longer the enthusiastic support for Marble Hill that there had been when the first shovel went into the ground. In 1984, with costs rising and protests becoming louder, the call was made to abandon the power plant in a state of near completion. Unsurprisingly, it's gone down in history as one of the most expensive failed construction projects ever. When the Hadron Collider in Europe successfully detected the presence of the Higgs boson particle in 2012, the scientists of America looked on enviously. This was supposed to be their discovery, and should have been made inside the superconducting super collider in Waxahachie, Texas. The colossal structure, also known as Deserttron, spent 10 years under construction before being canceled due to spiraling costs in 1993. By that point, construction workers had already dug out 14 miles of tunnels and spent more than $4.5 billion. Almost all machinery, save for the generators, was pulled out of the tunnels and sold off, but that didn't even get close to covering the gargantuan costs of the failed enterprise. It was a huge financial loss, but it was also a huge loss in terms of science. Had the Deserttron ever got up and running, it would have been capable of more than 3 times the collision energy output of the Hadron Collider. Since its abandonment, no use for the tunnels or facilities has been found. There was a rumor that Google might take the site on as a data storage facility several years ago, but nothing ever came of it. The latest word is that the land now belongs to a chemical company. When you hear the name Henry Ford, the first thing that will come to your mind is his world-famous car company. There was a lot more to Ford than cars, though. In fact, a little under a century ago, he set up a whole town in Brazil where people could live according to Ford's ideals. The benefits of Ford owning a town in Brazil weren't entirely unconnected to his automobile business, though. He was angry about the rising price of rubber in Asia, so he decided to harvest his own from Brazil and build a town around the processing plant for workers to live in. In what ought to have been seen as a sign of his impending megalomania, he named the town Fordlandia. The residents were paid well for the 1920s, but were also banned from eating meat because Ford himself was a vegetarian. That's despite the fact that Ford didn't live there and very rarely visited. Residents were also banned from drinking alcohol and were expected to work almost every waking hour of every day. The workers rebelled and kicked Ford's representatives out of town in 1928, then abandoned it completely around 2 years later. The skeletons of the old buildings are still standing there today. Speaking of abandoned towns, here's another one, in Latvia. It's called Irbin, and you'll find it in Ventspils County. Back in the days of the Soviet Union, the residents of this town were military officers and their families who were billeted to the town to protect and work on a top-secret Soviet radar facility known only as STAR. As is the case with many former Soviet facilities of this kind, it was abandoned shortly after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Troops and officers stayed on here for a while, but packed their bags and left for good in 1993. The enormous radio telescope is still in use today and belongs to the Ventspils International Radio Astronomy Center. but there's nobody living in the former houses dotted around it. The village has an eerie tone and would make for an ideal location if somebody wanted to film a post-apocalyptic horror movie. In some cases, clothing and possessions belonging to the former soldiers are still visible through the windows of the houses, almost a full 30 years after they moved out. The radar telescope in Irbin is far from being the only piece of Cold War-era tech that's standing unattended. Over on the American side of the divide, we find the so-called White Alice communications antennas standing on Anvil Mountain, Nome, Alaska. During the height of the Cold War, these structures played a crucial role in the USA's ballistic missile early warning system. Unlike the radar in Latvia, though, it didn't stay operational for the entirety of the Cold War. Instead, it was shut down in 1979. Part of the reason that the antennas haven't been demolished in the 40 years since is that the process would be expensive and hazardous. The structures are full of lead and asbestos and covered in fuel waste. Despite that, the locals would be sad to see them go. They view White Alice as having played an important role in both state and national history and point to the antenna network as a local landmark in an area that has very few of them. They'll probably rust and corrode to the point where they'll have to be taken down one day, but for now, they're still standing as a monument to darker days. Carlton Villa on Carlton Island, New York, looks like the perfect stereotype of a haunted house. You wouldn't be surprised to knock on the door and have it answered by Dracula's butler. It wasn't supposed to look so foreboding, though. In fact, when architect William Miller designed and built it in 1894, he envisioned it as a summer residence. His client was William Wyckoff, best known for popularizing the typewriter. Because of Wyckoff, the villa is believed to be cursed. Wyckoff's wife passed away because of a heart attack only weeks before the couple was due to move into the property. And then Wyckoff himself suffered a fatal heart attack on his first night in the new home. Understandably, their son wanted nothing to do with the villa. He sold it to General Electric as soon as he received the deeds. They sold off the marble cladding and stained glass and anything else they could find before their plans for demolition had to be abandoned because of the outbreak of the Second World War. It's been derelict and abandoned ever since and has been on sale for all that time without ever finding a buyer. High in the mountains above Fenestrelle in Italy sits Fenestrelle Fort, guarding against an attack on Turin that's never going to come. It stands on the remains of Fort Mouton, an old French fort, but became part of Sardinia after the Duchy of Savoy defeated the French and took control of the territory in 1709. Work on a new fortress began in 1728, but wasn't considered entirely complete until 1850. By that point, the threat of attack on Turin via the Chisone Valley was almost unthinkable. It's no wonder that construction work took so long. The fort covers more than 3 million square feet and is surrounded by an exterior wall that runs on for 4 miles. As the prospect of attack was so unlikely by the time the fort was finished, Fenestrelle was instead used by the Kingdom of Sardinia to house political prisoners, including supporters of Mazzini and Garibaldi. It resumed defensive duties during both World Wars, but was deemed obsolete at the end of the second one and entered abandonment. Despite the general sense of decay that exists here, Fenestrelle Fort is listed by the World Monuments Fund as one of the top 100 archaeological sites in the world. Unbeknownst to most of its residents, Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam stands on top of a secret underground bunker system known as the Kuchi Tunnels. It's not all that surprising that the majority of people don't know the tunnels are there. They're difficult to find access to and very cramped once you get inside them. We wouldn't recommend them to any sightseers who struggle with claustrophobia. You might suspect that the tunnels were used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. And you'd be right. Many of the living spaces and other facilities within the tunnel network are of Viet Cong design, but they didn't create the tunnel system. They were actually dug out during the 1940s by civilians as they resisted the French occupation. They dug out almost 80 miles worth of tunnels by the 1960s, making them a perfect lair for Vietnamese soldiers. Even today, it's feared that there are still untriggered booby traps down there waiting to go off on an unsuspecting tourist. As if that threat wasn't bad enough, the tunnels are also home to a number of species of insects and snakes. We think we'll give them a pass in terms of paying a visit, but we do enjoy the pictures. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.